Synopsis. In a dusty neighborhood where engines cough and people barter with time instead of coin, Miriam, an unassuming, fiercely proud mechanic, mends a broken engine for Farhan Qureshi, a restless millionaire escaping his gilded cage. Her steady hands and quiet competence set a course neither could have predicted. A luxury helicopter descends at Miriam's door the next day, offering sudden wealth and a world of choices. The story follows Miriam's internal reckoning and outward decisions as she navigates temptation, community expectations, and the moral cost of help. It is a cinematic, intimate study of class, agency, and destiny. How a single act of care can unmask vulnerability, shift power, and demand that both the giver and receiver reinvent what they think they want. Miriam had the habit of listening to engines the way others listen to prayer. In the alley behind her father's shuttered, cobbler's stall, where a single battered fan spun lazily in the summer heat, she could tell the mood of a machine by the way it wheezed. A faint metallic cough at dawn, the steady staccato of a city bus at noon, the desperate rasp of something older, starving on glue and grit. Each sound translated in her head into a problem, and, therefore, an answer. It was a small, private kind of divinity. She learned from crooked radio dials and an uncle who smelled of oil and mint tea. She learned in the afternoons when the neighborhood boys tried to impress a girl by pretending to know about carburetors, and she corrected them with a smile. She learned because there were bills and a sister named Zara who needed school books and a father whose hands shook and could longer hold a hammer. There was always a reason, practical as a wrench, to be useful. On the morning that would change everything, the air was the color of baked clay and humidity kept a skin-tight grip on the city. Miriam had pushed the rusted metal gate open at 7, flipped on the single hanging bulb in her tiny garage, and set out a rag, a battered toolbox, and 2 teacups with the chipped saucers she kept for good customers. She listened to a scooter cough its way down the lane and smiled at its modest dignity. The vehicle that choked to a stop in front of her, however, was not modest. It was an older Land Rover, polished, but respectful of its age. The kind of car that a person who had time and money used to get from one private place to another without touching the city. 2 men in crisp shirts stepped out. One was tall and spare-faced, the other broad and older, with a nervous, vacationing kind of smile. Someone in the back did not move. Miriam watched them through the open door, knotting the rag at her waist. The tall man's shoes were the kind that made a small, authoritarian hush when they hit concrete. He carried a phone the way others carried prayer beads. He glanced around the alley, displeased, curious, and then at her. "She's inside," said the broad man. His voice was careful with deference. They stepped into her workspace like men entering a small, quiet temple. Oil smelled sharp and honest in the air. Farhan Qureshi's name arrived after the first introduction, a soft, incredulous murmur from the older of the 2 companions, and a card with embossed letters that blinked against her rag-streaked palm like a sudden moon. "Philanthropist," the broad man said, as if that explained everything. "Investor," Farhan corrected with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He looked as if he had been born into a room with softer carpets and then learned to live outside of his own comfort to see what else might exist. His car had stalled on an uncooperative turn near the river, he said. He had been impatient with the mechanic at his club. He had been patronizingly reassured by polite men in uniforms who wanted a token fee and a promise. He had been, finally, intrigued by the rumor of a woman in a ragged garage who could listen to anything. Miriam usually refused fancy customers who thought they were doing charity by patronizing her. She preferred customers who understood that an engine's grime was its truth, that work required patience and honesty rather than a check with a fat number on it. But she also understood money when it came as a way to buy Zara a better uniform for school and to pay for the small patch on their father's chemo schedule. So she took the card, wiped her hands on her jeans, and went to the car. The engine smelled like someone had stuffed a cigar into its throat and left it for days. It coughed and threw up a little smoke when Farhan turned the key, and something metallic inside the hood gave up a tiny, distracted groan. Miriam crouched, fingerprinted the air, and listened. She tightened one jaw muscle and felt her fingers go to work. She lifted the hood with the sort of reverence a surgeon has for a patient. Grace mapped itself on her palms. Like a history she would not trade. Inside, the hoses were a tangle of ignored promises. A sensor wire snapped like a thin twig, and the carburetor followed with black tea leaves of ash and melted rubber. Common problems to people who had unremarkable, hard-working cars, but rarer to a man whose life could have been cushioned against such things. She was exactly as calm as she needed to be. Her hands moved with the memory of work. Unfasten this, pry gently at that, refill, test, wait. Farhan watched with an intensity sometimes reserved for surgeons, and sometimes for depressed poets, as if both parts of his life were trying to be useful at once. You don't. He began, then stopped. He had expected fuss, maybe a short conversation about rates, maybe the kind of look that does not hide flattery. Instead, Miriam hummed at the engine's throat and said quietly, "There's a leak in the injector line. Small. I can seal it. You need a new coil. I can clean this too, but it'll come back if we don't change it." "How much?" he asked. "For now. A cup of sugar," she said without looking up. The joke landed between them like a pebble. Farhan laughed. It was a fragile, human sound. They worked together in the empty city dawning around them. He fetched parts she pointed to. He held light while she knelt. He offered water, and then coffee that tasted too expensive for the place. In the course of 2 hours, the Land Rover breathed again. It sounded, when she keyed it, like a man who had been given back his voice. Farhan sat in the driver's seat and let the engine idle. He looked at her through the car window as if she were a small planet, and he had traveled there by mistake. "Who taught you?" he asked. "My uncle," Miriam said. "He liked to fix radios and teach me the difference between a loose wire and a broken promise." "And you? Do you want to keep doing this?" Her chest tightened. She had thought about this question often, but never expected it to be posed by a man with a station in life that could make words into deeds. "I have to," she said. "My sister needs school. My father needs medicine. My garage keeps us fed." Farhan nodded like he had just read a line in a book that made no sense to his life of rooms full of curated art. "Can I pay you now?" She accepted the envelope. Small for the service offered yet generous for the neighborhood, and tucked it into a drawer without letting it show. He stood hesitating, the way a man stands on the lip of a memory he cannot quite enter. "I'd like to do more," he said finally. "I invest in projects that mean something. I like people who make things better with their hands." Miriam had heard that language before. It usually translated into terms that ended with heavy legal phrasing. "I like fixing engines," she said, "not projects." He smiled then in a way that said he was more sincere than he looked. "Would you let me come by tomorrow? I want to see where you work properly." She said yes because she had a practical mind, and tomorrow might be another morning of listening to engines. She did not know, in that small and inevitable way, that accepting him would set the neighborhood's air to a different pressure. The land around their alley had its own economy of sound. Children sold flattened mangoes. Old women in bright dupatas laughed like bells. The smell of lentils and spices stitched itself through every afternoon. Miriam's work had always been a part of that weave. Word of her competence traveled like an honest rumor, without much fanfare, without social media, without glossy ads. until it arrived in rooms with high ceilings and art that did not match the tile. The next morning, the sky was a sheet of blue so clean it embarrassed the city. Zara had braided her hair neatly and braided Miriam's pride into it, with the same careful hands. Their father slept with a magazine folded beneath his chest, a placeholder between one long breath and the next. Miriam went to sweep the floor, to open the gate, and to set out the teacups she used for customers she trusted. She did not notice the shadow at first, a moving dark that cut her doorway like a sentence through a page. The sound came like a new animal to the neighborhood, a deep, repetitive thrum that made the dust on the rooftop vibrate. The children stopped mid-laugh and craned their necks. The shopkeepers shut their doors, not out of fear, but because the sound startled holy things. A helicopter lowered itself with the deliberateness of a confession and landed on the small patch of cleared ground outside their building. It painted the courtyard with dust and an expensive kind of smoke. For a second, Miriam and Zara stood like two women caught on a stage, and the whole neighborhood was the audience. Farhan emerged from the cockpit, not alone. He wore a simple shirt and trousers that tried hard not to appear curated. Beside him was a woman with a sharp bob and sunglasses that shielded her gaze like an armor. A man with an official air, security, perhaps, followed. For once Farhan seemed embarrassed by his own extravagance. "This is probably dramatic," he said, a laugh stuck in his throat. "I apologize for the noise." The crowd pushed forward, human curiosity braided with suspicion. Someone shouted jokes. Words about helicopter weddings, about rich men's whims. And someone else hissed a private envy. Zara's eyes were wide and clear as a glass bead, but Miriam felt only the solidity of the moment crystallizing. The world had offered something large and loud and oddly honest. "Good morning," Farhan said, and his voice was warm, carrying, as if he had rehearsed the simplest sentence like a sacred text. He moved toward Miriam as if toward an altar. "What's this for?" she asked, feeling for ground that did not shift. "For you," he said. "Not for the garage, for you." He wanted to take her to a foundation he ran, he explained. He wanted to pay for internships, for tools, for a small loan to open a proper workshop in a better part of town. He wanted to give her a stipend that could make Zara's future one of choice rather than debt. He spoke of mentorship and exposure and the kind of networking that could change lives. He offered her a card. Again, the small, embossed moon of paper, and a check with a number that seemed to glow. Miriam felt the crowd presence like a pressure. Neighbors leaned on each other's shoulders to watch. The man across the street, who ran the corner phone shop, clapped his hands, like a man at a hen's birth, proud, and sure the chick would be fine. Old Mrs. Ebal adjusted her headscarf and studied Farhan as if checking the handwriting on a testament. Zara was the first to speak. "You want my sister to leave," she said, not meanly, not unkindly. "Will she still fix radios? Will she still come here? Will you let her have a place to come back to?" "Of course," he said. "This is not exile. This is chance." Chance had a cost. Miriam watched the men around her, the ones who cleared gutters and fixed leaky roofs, and she felt an aching logic. If she left, who would fix their engines? If she accepted, would she be the kind of woman who could walk the steps of a silk-floored building and not feel like a fraud? In the shining coin of possibility, she could buy Zara new uniforms and medicine and perhaps call her father by his old name without the ache. She could also become a thing that could be given away token, curated, used. "I'll think about it," she said. Farhan nodded, as if that were sensible. The helicopter rose as the neighborhood exhaled. Dust settled like an inspection of what had passed. That afternoon, the neighborhood circulated like a living thing. Mrs. Iqbal visited and blessed Miriam as if she were a small prophet. The children followed Miriam around the alley to hear how the rich man had behaved. The men who mended roofs told jokes about being helicopter mechanics next time. The sound of the day held an undertow, curiosity braided with the old human calculations of hope versus betrayal. As the possibility hovered, another force arrived to complicate matters. Assad, a mechanic across the market who had always eyed Miriam's competence like a wounded pride, came by with a grin like a broken coin. He had been there when she took down misted carburetors and pretended that her successes were accidents. "So Farin's rich," he said, leaning against her workbench with an arrogance that smelled like beer. "You going to be his little success story now?" His questions were not harmless. They cut. Someone whose world had always been small and honest could be made to feel fraudulent by the suspicion of those who stayed. Miriam's reply was sharp, not because she wanted to wound, but because she wanted to state reality. "I fixed his car," she said. "Nothing for his money changes who I am. My hands remember where I come from." Assad scoffed. "Hands don't buy you doors, Miriam. Money does." That night, Miriam dreamed she was in the cockpit of a helicopter, the city passing beneath like a painted map. She woke with the memory of the rotors pressing against her chest and Zara's small face hovering above her like a lighthouse. The days that followed were not simple. Offers came in the form of polite emails, of phone calls that required time she did not have, of invitations that bore an undercurrent of expectation. Farin sent his assistant to the alley with a list of conditions and proposals. One to sponsor a local girls' technical scholarship, another to refurbish the empty lot opposite Miriam's shop into a proper garage where she could take apprentices. He promised training, exposure, and a sum of money that made Zara squeal simply by association. But there were also things money could not buy: outright trust, the goodwill of neighbors who feared being left behind, and the quiet day-by-day dignity of waking up to a world where one's hands mattered. The community that had raised her was both a comfort and a weight. If she accepted the helicopter gift and climbed into a life of air, conditioned rooms, and celebrity photographs, would the stitch of daily life that bound them loosen? Would her father understand why she no longer took the early morning route to pick up the bread? Would Zara feel proud or abandoned? The months stretched into a negotiation. Farhan became a real presence, not an amber-tinged rumor, arriving with books and people who asked difficult and flattering questions. He listened more than he spoke. He told her once that the helicopter was not a show. It had been a recklessness he permitted himself because he had, at last, found someone whose work was not ornamental. "I have spent years buying things to fill a silence," he said, looking at the skein of wiring in her hands like it could solve something inside him. "Your hands make that silence live." Miriam learned things in his world as much by watching as by being told. She learned that wealth could be lonely in a particular way. It built cages of expectations that were heavy with other people's needs. She also learned that not all wealth was selfish. Some of it desired to heal. Farhan's foundation allocated grants and small loans, and he wanted Miriam to steer a portion toward practical training for girls and women in trades, an idea that hummed in her chest like a spring wanting to open. But there were tensions. Assad's barbs sharpened into more public attacks. He accused her of abandonment in the market square, called her a traitor to the neighborhood, and complained that she would sell their trade to men with salted checkbooks. Whether he believed it or was jealous of the attention, his voice made things complicated. Miriam felt the pressure of the city's gossip in her ribs. Then, one night, someone broke into the alley. It was not a tidy theft, it was clumsy anger. A window was smashed, a lamp broken, the slogan mural that Zakra had helped paint defaced with a spray of dark emotion. They had not taken the tools. Tools were heavy and greedless, but had left ashes of threat. The message was simple: don't change what is. The neighborhood blinked in the morning like a single living thing startled. Farhan came with a steady, practical outrage. He set men to patrol the area. He offered a reward for information. But he also did something softer. He sat on Miriam's step under the ceiling of the twilight and said, "I knew this would be hard. I knew that change asks for enemies in the beginning. You brought it here." She said, the words not accusatory but factual. He thought about that. He had been a man of choices. He had moved from a world where consequences arrived in neat, legal parcels. He had not been prepared for the noisy, messy human reaction to sudden light. "Then I ask you, teach me how to stay. Teach me how to keep this from becoming a spectacle. Show me how to help without becoming trouble." What he offered was not to buy tranquility. It was to buy time, mentorship, and the promise of a program that would be community-run rather than imposed. "If you accept, we will call it your name," he said. "Your workshop, your apprentices, your terms." The apex of the story came not with money or with helicopters, but in a confrontation that could have destroyed everything. Assad, goaded by old grudges and new fear, confronted Miriam in front of a crowd one sweltering afternoon. He accused her of being a puppet and demanded she choose. Either take the money and leave them with charity, or refuse and stay and be one of them. Miriam felt her pulse as methodically as she tightened a bolt. She could have answered with blows, with bitter insults, with the language of the market that reduced everything to summations. Instead, she did something older and more dangerous. She told the truth. "You think I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady enough to carry through the market. "You think that the only way to get food is to become a different kind of person. But you're wrong. I want both." She explained then, to their stunned silence, what she had been offered and what she had made of it. "I will not take your work and sell it to a man who wants a story," she said. "I will not become a scene. I will build a place for girls to learn engines and electricity and plumbing. I will teach them, and I will bring someone in who knows little about our world, if they are willing to learn it without changing it. I will keep my garage. I will create another one in a place where our sisters can work safely." At Assad's face went a color of copper rage, and then something like shame. The crowd's murmur turned into a slow, gathering applause. It was not the applause of flattery. It was the sound of a community being offered agency. Someone began to chant Zara's name in the railing of the rooftop. Mrs. Iqbal wept quietly, making the hem of her hand into a small mop of blessing. Farhan stood to the side, watching, his eyes bright. The man who had once thought he could buy the world now understood that what mattered was being tethered to the truth of a person's life. He stepped forward when the space felt right and laid out an offer that sounded like a compromise because it was. He would fund Miriam's new workshop but not control it. He would appoint no board to oversee the curriculum. He would instead sponsor equipment and scholarships. He would buy the land but make the deed irrevocable to the community and instruct his lawyers that the funds were a one-time gift, not a tool for celebrity, but for infrastructure. He would, in one clause, write that the new garage be run by a council of women selected by Miriam. Miriam listened and asked for conditions of her own, that the men who worked in the workshop be paid fair wages, that apprentices be drawn from across the neighborhood because talent was universal, that Zara be allowed to study what she wanted, that no publicity be permitted that reduced the program to a line in a magazine. Her final condition was simple and a little wild. She asked that Farhan spend 3 months working in the garage every August, learning from the people who had made her world go. He agreed with a laugh and a sudden seriousness, as if in that agreement they had both signed toward a healing. The new workshop opened in an awkward ceremony. No red ribbon, Just a handful of women and children laughing as they painted the walls a bright, defiant blue. The helicopter still came sometimes. Farhan would land it and climb down with an apron over his shirt and a scarf around his neck like a man from a different weather, tasting the city's air. He learned to change oil. He learned, clumsily, to listen to an engine. The neighborhood school offered short courses, and Miriam taught a class on humility that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with work. As months became a year, the change that had once glittered like a threat became an ordinary miracle. The workshop produced apprentices who could rewire a house in a day, and a woman, Fatima, who rewired the mosque's lighting and was praised by the imam. A small bank offered microloans to women whose names, for once, were etched in ledger books. Assad, chastened and patched by a bitter pride, found his way back into a partnership and apologized with an awkwardness that tasted like truce. Farhan found that being tethered did not constrict him. It altered the frame of his life until its edges included the neighborhood's daily mess. He took less pleasure in purchases and more in seeing Zara and others hold a soldering iron with a steady hand. His solitude changed shape, no longer a silk-lined cage but a room with a door he opened sometimes. Miriam did not become a myth. She became, instead, a steady presence, someone who fixed engines and ran a workshop and learned to accept gratitude without letting it galled her. She kept her father's small room in her house and learned how to make him laugh on days when the world felt like too much. Zara grew into a bright, confident young woman who tried engineering because she wanted to and not because it was the only path. People sometimes asked if the helicopter had changed everything. Miriam would look at them the way she once listened to engines. Patient, amused, deep in the knowledge that some things are fixed by a hand and others by a choice. It changed one thing. She would say, it gave us a door. What we do with it is the rest. Years later, someone would write about the garage in a small magazine, an article that spoke politely about philanthropic intervention. Farhan would clip it, not to pin it as a trophy, but because he wanted to show Zahra how the world had once tried to capture them in a headline. Miriam framed a different piece of paper, a student's drawing of a car with the words, Miriam's Garage, scribbled in a child's looped hand. It hung above the workbench like a small, stubborn map. On afternoons when the city baked into the color of old coins, Miriam would sit and listen to an old radio that picked up distant songs. Children would come by for advice or sweets, or to ask her to look at a stubborn motorbike. She would rub grease into her palms and remember the day the helicopter landed. She never stopped believing that engines had souls. She stopped, eventually, believing that money could rewrite a person's worth. She believed, instead, in hands in the way they could mend a valve, stitch a seam, turn a page. The helicopter had been showy and loud, but its true gift had been quiet, a recognition that sometimes the world must be invited to learn before it can properly help. On the porch of the workshop, under strings of drying rags that fluttered like pennants, Farhan once asked her, about 5 years after the landing, whether she ever regretted saying yes. Miriam measured the question with the exactness of someone who had learned to weigh bolts by sight. No, she said. But I did not let it make me less myself. He nodded, and the sound between them was like the small, honest clink of tools being set down after a day's honest work. The helicopter still came sometimes, for errands and to ferry people to conferences where they spoke of empowerment in neat slides. But its shadow was no longer an omen. It had become a part of the sky's vocabulary. One more sound among many, and Miriam's ears had room for the rest. The last thing she taught Zahra before the young woman left for a scholarship abroad was how to listen to an engine. It tells you what it needs, Miriam said, wiping her hands on the rag at her waist. Fix it gently. And always, Always remember that money can be a tool or a trap. It's up to you to keep the door open. Zara leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the bright blue of the workshop wall. "Will you be at the door?" she asked. Miriam smiled, and that smile had the soft, honest tuck of someone who had lived through storms and chosen to stay. I will be on the other side, with a cup of tea and a spare bolt." When Zara left, the doorway felt both full and empty. The helicopter that had once announced the beginning of their change was no longer the herald of their lives. It had served as an instrument to show them how they might move, together or apart, and what it meant to welcome the world without losing the ground. In the end, Miriam's destiny was not written in the stamp of the chick, nor in the flash of rotor blades, but in the small, stubborn business of keeping a place where people could come to be fixed back together. The doors she opened and kept open were not spectacular. They were, to her, the only kind that mattered.